Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Grant Professionals Association's webinar. This webinar is titled Learning to Answer the Sustainability Question. My name is Kelly Romero, and I'm the Membership Director for GPA and your webinar moderator for today. You are all placed in listen-only mode. If you would like to ask a question, please use the chat box on the left side of your screen to submit your questions. We will get to as many questions as time permits. There will be a few breaks, and then at the end of the webinar, you can ask any questions that you have. At the end of this webinar, you will be directed to a brief survey. We ask that you please fill it out to assist us with our future webinars. This webinar is being recorded. Later today, you will receive the recording in your email. Please be on the lookout for it as it will look like the email invitation that you received yesterday to access today's webinar. Today's presenters are Margit, Brazda, Poirier, and Danny Blitch. Danny is employed as a City of Roswell, Georgia's grant manager. His 20-plus years of experience includes grant work at a regional development center, county board of education, state university's development office, and as a grant consultant. Danny is a frequent speaker, workshop presenter, author, former GPA board member, and is actually one of the masterminds behind International Grant Professionals Day and Week. Margit is owner of Grants for Good, LLC, a company she created to help nonprofit organizations achieve their grant development goals. Margit has written and received numerous grants from federal, state, foundation, and corporate sources, and she has a unique perspective of understanding both grant seeking and grant making, given her the experience leading a prominent New York-based foundation. She is a published GPA Journal author and frequent speaker on all aspects of grant writing. Welcome, everyone, and Danny and Margit, please feel free to begin your webinar.
Sounds good. Thank you, Kelly, for the introduction, and welcome everybody who's here so far. We are really excited to present on this topic today. It's clearly a very popular topic and one that we are all struggling with at the moment. So we hope that in this next hour, we will help you answer the sustainability question. So first, let's look at our outcomes today. They are, one, we're going to gain an understanding of the types of sustainability questions that are typically posed in grant applications and the common pitfalls. We're going to see examples of how to answer the sustainability question. We're going to learn how to use the sustaining outcomes approach and how to understand the elements of a sustainability plan. So ultimately, the goal of this webinar is to help you to better plan and craft your answer to one of the more difficult questions that you'll see in a grant proposal. So the sustainability question, we have all seen this one before, whether you've been in the field for 20 years or whether you're new to grant development. You've seen something along the lines of, how will you continue the program after the grant funds end? Right? It's a tough one. The easy answer might be, well, I'll just work harder, do my job better, and write more grants. I bet a few of you have written that answer, that you will write more grants. I know that I have. So that's why Danny and I chose to research into this topic further and really look at what are some great answers to this question. And really, even the bigger picture is, how do we sustain our programs? Because we want our work to have meaning. So we want to answer this question for ourselves as well as for our grant applications and funders. So who asks the sustainability question? Well, in looking at hundreds of grant proposals and applications throughout the years, just about everybody seems to ask it, whether it's private foundations, corporate foundations, federal and state grants have some form of this question in their applications. And even if you're involved in fundraising and donor management, you know that those individual donors, they too want to know what happens, how do you spend the money and what happens after you spend all the money. So it's an important question to pretty much everybody that we work with. Here are some examples of the types of questions that we consider sustainability questions. The first one you might have seen, what is the future of this program or project beyond the grant period? Pretty typical question. Most grant periods are 1 year, so what will happen after a year? Another one might look like this. What are your other potential and actual sources of support for this proposal? I've seen this one in almost every grant application. And then they follow up with, where do you expect to find future support? Now notice the question says future support. It doesn't necessarily say future cash. So we're already starting to think a little bit beyond grants at this point. The third question is a little different from the other two. Explain how this proposal relates to the organization's mission, goals, and/or strategic plan. Now, this third question is also addressing sustainability, but in a slightly different way. And this is really important because we are going to be talking about sustainability plans and their relation to mission and vision, and also to outcomes. So we're going to get back to that one. So sustainability defined. Well, this is according to the dictionary, the ability to be sustained, supported, upheld, or confirmed. Sounds pretty good. The second definition relates to environmental science, which relates close to home because back in the early 1990s when I was in graduate school and my degree was in natural resource management, environmental science, we talked sustainability all the time, but it meant something different then. It meant saving the environment. Now sustainability in the grant profession has that first meaning and closely aligns with our grant development work. Sustainability equals stable, but here's the problem. We all know that grants aren't sustainable, and they're definitely not stable. We know from experience that grants come and go. They get funded one year or not the next, sometimes by the same funder, or they don't get funded at all. When we do get funded, we scramble to deliver the project, evaluate it, manage the finances, and report back to our funders. And that's where things sometimes end, or at least slow down. Well, we want to change that. So getting more grants isn't necessarily the best answer to this question, and it's not the best strategy for your organization. So again, this webinar is more than answering a tough question on a grant application. We hope that you leave here with some strategies to keep your organization performing really well over the long term. And there's the key, long term. Sustainability is all about long-term value for your community. It doesn't necessarily mean the project will continue intact. I don't know about you, but when I first started writing grants back in the 1990s with paper applications, it did seem to mean that the project would continue intact. But I think we're looking much broader now. So sustainability could mean that the program or service you're applying to does continue intact, or it could mean maintaining it or increasing impact, or it could mean partnering or broadening scope. We'll get into all of those options. But the bottom line is it does mean long-term impact and that your program or your work becomes a permanent part of the community's resources. It doesn't mean you have to start over your program again with the next grant. Nobody wants that. So as we know, this is a bit of a stumbling block for a number of grant professionals in the field, probably all of us at some point in time. But is it an unfair question? Well, not necessarily. It's certainly a difficult question, but if you address it early on in your project planning, it'll serve you very well strategically. So let's take just a moment and look at this from the funder's perspective. If you were an investor and you had $1 million, wouldn't that be nice? You could invest $1 million in a startup company. What would you want in return? You'd probably want $10 million back. Any investor who invests typically wants at least a 1 to 10 return, and that has to be in cash. So foundation leaders and boards are different. They can't have their money back. They don't want it back. But what do they want instead? I think we all know that they really want to see an impact for their dollars. They want to know what has changed for the better. And that's what we're answering when we talk about the sustainability question. So keep in mind the funder sitting on the other side of this, and they just want to know what's going to be different because of this grant. So that means we as grant professionals need the usual things: measurable outcome, long-term impact, reliable data, ongoing evaluation, partnerships, et cetera, et cetera. And again, ideally, the most successful components of your program should be part of that overall process of positive change in your community. Okay, that's big picture stuff. My colleague Danny is going to step in, and he's going to give some examples of addressing sustainability in government grants as well as foundation and corporate grant applications. And I should also say we're going to, about halfway through, we're going to pause for questions, but feel free to enter any in the chat box. And, of course, at the end, we'll also have time for questions. Danny?
Thanks. And I also want to remind folks that if they want to acknowledge something that they like, they can add that to the chat box. Or, of course, if you want to laugh, you're more than welcome to, put in a ha-ha or a laugh out loud. So welcome, everybody, and it's happy to say hello. Thanks, Rhonda. And so we're going to play a game. We're going to play Grant Family Feud. So survey is 100 people were surveyed. The top answers are on the board. If your grant request is approved, how will you ensure sustainability? All right, so first one is number 6, and the answer would be we protect Mother Earth. And we know that that is not the kind of sustainability that we're here to talk about. Number 5 is easy peasy. We're just going to get more grants. And we know that that cannot be your answer because grant projects will end. Our grant writer is paid on commission, number 4, and this is unethical. So no, this cannot be your answer. Number 3 is we hired a national level fundraiser. And this is, kind of one and done. However, are you going to be hiring this national level fundraiser forever? Because that would be sustainable. Otherwise, you're not sustainable. And then, of course, number 2 is year 2 is not going to be as expensive as the startup year. And so I don't know how that's sustainable in anybody's mind, but that is one of the answers we've seen. And then, of course, the board chair knows lots and lots of rich people. And this also is not sustainable for lots of reasons, mainly because it's false a lot of times, but also because there's something called term limits. So making change is easy, but sustaining change is very difficult. And so part of the issue to properly define the problem, another part is to design a practical solution that focuses on the need. Next, people need to be trained on the problem and taught to stop old habits, and we need to introduce a new solution, a new improved way, and then we must result in an actual change in habits. So change is easy, but sustaining change is very difficult, and there are behaviors that are even more difficult to sustain. So there's a great book out there by the Heath brothers called Switch, How to Change Things When Change is Hard. You may have heard of them before. They wrote a book called Make It Stick. So the question is, how will you continue? And sometimes the question is about impact. How will the impact continue after the funding is gone? And from the funder's perspective, they think of things like, are we about to invest in a dud? Will we hear back from this same group in a year or less? Are we just throwing money down a hole? And we don't want that. And so the answer is not because, but because we have a plan is our answer. And, I like to say even a bad plan is better than no plan. So we're going to take a look at how it's done out there in the world. And this is an example. This is a Georgia Department of Education grant called 21st Century Community Learning Centers grant. And it is from a federal funding source. So this program is nationwide. And so some of the clues that we're going to be looking at here is that in the first line, it talks about that you have to have a plan, a sustainability plan. You also notice here that it reduces every year, 90% in year 4, 80% in year 5, and ultimately there's no funds at the end. So there's also a notion here about partnerships. They have to be collaborative. There's also 5-year grant funding actually ends. So partners must contribute something, and there's actually a place for specific descriptions of the investment that each partner is going to make. And so the final notion is that at the end, in years 4 and 5, there can be no reduction in services to allow for this funding. So this is kind of a harsh kind of sustainability plan that must be in place. And so we're going to look a little bit closer at how education does it. And we've all seen this question. And so, do you have evidence that you can share in your grant proposal of the financial capacity that you have? And evidence is not just something that you throw out there. Evidence is irrefutable facts. So this would be your track record. So here's how Human Services does it. And those of you who aren't familiar, Health and Human Services is the largest government funding grant agency in the United States. And so you must not only develop a sustainability plan, but you must also implement a sustainability plan. So getting another grant isn't going to be enough. So human services are expensive. And so how good is your plan? Because this one wants to know the evaluation criteria for Health and Human Services is the extent to which the sustainability plan actually will result in the project being sustained after the funding ends. And so can you evaluate your sustainability plan that you put in your proposal? Can you evaluate it on a scale, say, of 1 to 5? And where is your plan? And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. And so one of the clues here is that you need to have started this at the earliest stages of your planning. Some more clues. We're going to look at how corporate foundations do it. So this is the Chase Community Giving Foundation, and this is the criteria from their guidelines. And it says that there has to be effective management. So this is a clue. There has to be a diversity of funding sources. We're going to talk about that. There has to be a valid need that you're addressing. So that's, kind of critical to all of this. And then, of course, there has to be collaboration with other organizations for maximum leverage. And we also want you to be able to document your success. So these are all the clues that are headed towards what a sustainability plan includes. All right, and so this is the Annenberg Foundation, which is founded by Walter Annenberg. And he actually never graduated from college, but is said to have donated over $2 billion to education. He actually dropped out of the Wharton School of Business. But so some of the clues about how private foundations do it is there's this board participation component. There is a give or get, as well as there's a conversation about partners. And then, of course, the whole notion of a plan comes up again. And so we're going to pause here for some questions.
If any of you have any questions, please feel free to use them in the chat box.
And Kelly, if not, I don't mind continuing, and we'll address questions as they show up, and also, of course, at the end.
Okay. Yeah, I don't see it in the chat box, so I would just go ahead.
Great, because we have a lot of material to cover that's hopefully going to get people started on this question. So I think by now in the webinar, you know that there is an easy answer trap. Of course, there are no easy answers. And definitely writing more grants and raising more funds is not going to be what works. So I'm going to take this time in the webinar to talk about a document that was attached in your webinar invitation, and it's called Sustaining Improved Outcomes, a Toolkit. It was published in 2010 by two PhD research authors, and I found it to be extremely useful in my grant development work. Also, interestingly enough, the project, this paper, was funded by 3 regional foundations. It was funded by the New York State Health Foundation, the Community Health Foundation of Western and Central New York, and the Asian Pacific Islander American Health Forum. So as I saw this, I had to wonder, did the authors have to answer the sustainability question before they got the funding? But I'm not sure about that. I'm from New York State, and recently we completed an application to the New York State Health Foundation. And sure enough, their application did ask us to indicate which of these outcomes we would factor into our sustainability of the project. And even if a funder doesn't ask this, and most likely they don't, this is going to be a very helpful tool for your work. What I like about this document is it's another way of looking at sustainability. Since funders are interested in impact and hence outcomes, then sustaining those outcomes should be our primary focus. What's the difference between sustaining outcomes versus sustaining programs or services or organizations? Well, pretty simply put, some level of money is required for sustaining an organization or program, but not necessarily for sustaining improved outcomes. Here's why. The way these authors define sustainability is that sustainability is new ways of working become the norm. And I'll repeat that. Sustainability is when new ways of working and the resulting improved outcomes become the norm. So this is really critical because this speaks to our goal of long-term impact. It speaks to our shared goal of long-term impact, the one we share with our funders. Now, some of you on the call maybe remember the term total quality management, which became very popular in the early 1990s. It evolved from the successful Japanese car industry in the 1980s, and it was all about improving processes, continuous improvement. What that meant was setting goals and measurable outcomes. Now, I worked for county government at that time, and boy, people really did not like this. They said, "You mean we have to measure everything?" And now we're sitting here 20-some years later as grant professionals, and we know we have to measure everything. It's the only way to show improvement. And since then, there's been Lean Six Sigma and other quality improvement processes that are used pretty widely in business, government, and the nonprofit sector. They all have one thing in common, the goal of improved processes and ways of doing things for better outcomes. So that's why I like this document and chose to share it with you. There are 12 factors in the document, but in the interest of time, I'm going to pick out 4 of these, and we'll give examples of those. And of course, feel free to look at which other factors pertain to your programs or services after the call. So let's look at the first one, staff. A program can be sustainable with staff. The way to define this is that staff have the skills, confidence, and interest in continuing, again, new ways of working and improved outcomes. So these examples, for example, staff utilize a new curriculum that is more effective at achieving particular outcomes, X, Y, and Z. Another example might be using the train-the-trainer model. This is one I've used quite a bit with some of the nonprofit clients that I've worked with, especially if you are in an organization that might have a high turnover rate, such as the daycare industry or some healthcare facilities. To have a train-the-trainer model might be one of the only cost-effective ways that you can ensure some fidelity of your work over time. So this is one I've used quite a bit. The good news about this model is that you can get funding, grants, to support the initial staff training and then hopefully see the long-term impact over time. Another example of a sustainability factor is shared models. And what they mean by this is the continued use of a shared model among those involved in the new ways of working. So that could be your organization, it could be various affiliates of your organization, or other people that you've chosen to partner with. Big Brothers Big Sisters of America, which you've most likely heard of, uses a standard model of mentoring. It's a very particular model of one-to-one mentoring and screening their mentors and matching the mentors and so on and so forth. So this is a shared model that is used among all the affiliates throughout the United States. Another sustainability factor involves partnerships, and we've all heard this term and how important it is. Involvement of partners who actively support new ways of working and improved outcomes. This is something I've seen pop up quite a bit in our community. For example, there are 2 really large local hospitals in the Rochester, New York region that in the last 10 years started to share expensive diagnostic equipment and services in hopes of reducing healthcare costs somewhat and making it more convenient for patients. You've probably seen similar examples in your region as well. So this is an example of partnering, reducing costs, and hopefully improving long-term impact for the community. Another example of showing partnerships as being a sustainability factor is a memorandum of understanding that details the commitment of project partners to continue a particular process, for example. In some cases, bringing partners together can also become the glue that implements the program. So I have written and received grants to actually build a coalition of partners. So that's where the money goes. And then because those partners share common goals and they decide to implement a project, together they end up not needing the funding anymore, because the funding was to put the coalition together. The long-term impact is the work that those partners continue as a coalition. The fourth sustainability factor involves spread, and this is one that we've probably addressed in a lot of grant applications, is you may start in a certain geographic region and want to expand. You may want to expand more people that you serve. So spread refers to expansion of new ways of working. Again, this new ways of working is repetitive, and improved outcomes to additional locations. So getting back to the example of big brothers, big sisters, an example would be of maybe 3 of those affiliates in a particular region working together to somehow attract mentor-mentee matches based on career interests. And this is a real example. So you may have youth who are interested in specific STEM careers and match them with mentors who are in that workforce. So the process that goes along with matching, making those matches, can be spread and duplicated to other regions. And many of you have probably been involved with duplicating projects in one way or another, or expanding them. Another example is a local facility that helps people with developmental disabilities that started offering an after-school program to youth with autism. It's a pretty expensive program. And once it started with one school district, other school districts started getting interested, as did the local YMCA, which is where the after-school program is now held. So that's an example of building partnerships and also building spread. Now, this still means there's the challenge of finding funding to keep up the program, but we can certainly answer the sustainability question in terms of the improved impact and the improved outcomes and community spread. So these are examples of how to use this document. They'll be useful as you start to develop your sustainability plan. And so as Danny starts talking about elements of a sustainability plan, keep in mind this different way of looking at the question in terms of sustaining outcomes.
So the elements of a sustainability plan. The chairman knows lots of rich people. No, that's not legit at all. So this is another way of thinking about it. So we've got a sustainability stool. Have you ever seen a sustainability or a stool at all that only had one leg? And of course you haven't. This is an easy answer, and so this is a trap. And this is because the right answer is going to be a very complicated answer. It's not going to be easy. And there's a reason why stools have more than one leg, and the answer is for sustainability concerns. So the answer should be equally as complicated as the issue that you are attempting to solve. If the issue has 3 facets, for example, the stool that you have better have at least 3 legs. And so the same can be said about folks who are getting closer and closer to retirement. You wouldn't want to rely on one way to fund your retirement. You wouldn't want to put all your eggs in one basket. And so you would need multiple sources of income. And same is true for sustainability. And so we've talked a lot about what the plan, that you have to have a sustainability plan. And so here's how we do it. And this is adapted from a Health and Human Services Office of Adolescent Health 2014 publication that's called Building Sustainable Programs, the Framework. And so here are the elements. There's 4. The assessment, build a case for support, develop strategies for establishing partnerships, develop strategies for resource development. So more is good. More legs to the stool is good. And depending on the space that you have in the application, more information is good. But you always want to make it your own. You don't want to put in a cookie cutter. You want it to kind of reflect what's going on with your organization. And so it also depends on the number of points that are assigned in the grant application to the sustainability plan on how lengthy and how detailed your answer needs to be. So we're going to talk about assessment. So first, we have to assess our current situation. There's some things that we would learn during that assessment, which would be planning early. We would be looking for gaps and so that we can identify better partners. We would be looking for services that we want to stay the same. We would also be looking for evidence of any kind of financial capacity that our partners or that we haven't tapped into. And of course, we want to implement the plan too. We want this to be realistic. We have to live with whatever it is that we put forth. So we want it to be something that actually is obtainable. And then there's always an opportunity to track our success, and we want to kind of follow up with that success after assessment. So the next is a case for support. And you know better than anyone else your organization's or your client's needs. And so when you're crafting your case for support, and sometimes we call this a need or a statement of need, you want to be positive. We want you to sell the solution. We want you to use data, but of course there's a fine line. Using too much data makes people's eyes glaze over. So we also want you to avoid any of the easy traps and focus on the continuing the impact long after you're gone. And you'll hear folks say, I'm leaving this in your capable hands in case I get hit by a bus over the weekend. So elements of the sustainability plan continue. So this is strategies for establishing partnerships. And so you never want to operate in a silo. You always want to work with others. The idea is that multiple hands make for like work. So you need to find ways to help the same target group, same target population, providing them with different services or different programs that they need that all work in conjunction with one another. And of course, relationships are key to this, and you want to share the credit always. You want to enhance those services and make the community better. We're going to talk a little bit about how you might prepare a case for partnerships. And this might be something that you've never thought about before, and so this may be a new concept. So the next is developing strategies for resource development. And so the notion here is that we want to come up with unique but good ways to be able to diversify our funding streams. We want multiple funding streams. We want many of them. And so your homework is to think about the kinds of funding streams that you have currently for your grant programs, and we want you to figure out a way to double those. All right, so the case for partnerships. And so the tip here is that this can be something that you could actually put together a document. It is not an official document per se. It is more of a bulleted list of the points that you want to use when you're communicating with a potential partner. And you want to come up with the ways that you would be, you want to appeal to the benefits of that partner for collaborating. So you want to address what all partners want to know, which is what's in it for them. And so you need to spend some time with your team trying to figure out what those things are, putting together kind of a case for support that is really a case for partnerships so that you have the tools to go out into the world and look for these partners, because partners come and go, relationships have to develop over time. And so if you need a partnership now, you should have already started. And the same would be true if you need a partner for 3 years down the road, you need to start immediately. So here's some things that you need to consider while you're putting together your sustainability plan. These are things that you would like to ponder. And if you haven't already considered some of these things in your planning effort, you want to organize either a team or a subset of your team to kind of think about these things and bring back these ideas to you. And so if you spend all of the grant funds that you just got awarded, does the need still exist? And so that's only something that you can answer. I cannot, but the likelihood is that the need still does exist. You probably haven't solved much of anything. So the new funding sources that are available to you, you should explore all of those. You should help those partners explore all of the funding sources that are available to them also. There is an opportunity to put things into your general fund operating budget so that they are permanent, so they are there when you need them. And then take some time to consider why you do what you do. And I think the answer should always be because it is important, because it is vital. And so there are some clues there on how you can find funding for it. And so just like we had 4 steps of the sustainability plan, 4 is also the number for sustainable, because that happens to be how many ways nonprofits can actually get money. 4. So say it to yourself, say it out loud, say it that it's 4 different ways that nonprofits get money. And so what does that look like? A lot of times we lump in together grants, contracts, and budget because grants are competitive, contracts are not competitive, but still it's money from a different funding source to you. And so budget is also kind of lumped into the same category with how you sustain your program. And so then donations could be the same thing, could be said of fundraising. You could use it as a catch-all. And so donations of all types fall into this. Major gifts, door-to-door, direct mail, every kind of fundraising falls into this. And then, of course, charging for services, this fee-for-services notion. This is important because there's always the conversation about, is there skin in game from the folks that are receiving the benefit? We want folks to be able to take it, internalize it, make it part of their own, rather than consider it something that is for free and therefore doesn't have any value. And so the fees for services question makes your program more sustainable. And then, of course, investment income. This is the one we hear about all the time in the news, these large endowments, these huge donors that make these gifts. And this is something that almost, it's rare for nonprofits. So very few actually are able to make investment income happen. There's really just 3. So the answer is in your mission and vision and goals. And we really can't say this enough. The answer is in your mission. And so here's an example of a mission statement. And this is from Hampton, Massachusetts Board of Health. And you'll notice in here that they say that what they're going to do is they're going to have innovative programs, and they are going to improve the general health of the citizens. And they're going to be doing this through disease prevention and wellness programs, which is also health education and then the dreaded environmental awareness. So disease prevention is really what they should be focusing on. This is what they should be getting grants, program fees, fundraising should be on wellness, disease prevention, education. So that's an example. The next one as an example is this is the vision of Banner Health Clinics, is we will be a national leader recognized for clinical excellence and innovation. So that's here. I'm not sure that you can get grants for highly coordinated patient experience, but you might be able to get fees for services, for example. And you may not be able to get grants because you have the distinguished quality of people on your staff, but you may be able to get fundraising for that. So that's kind of how that works. And Margaret, I'm jumping into your territory, so please take over.
Sure. Actually, I'm going to pause for a moment and read a couple of the questions that have come through the chat box. Excuse me. One of those questions says, if your nonprofit executive director doesn't allow for communication development of the board, how do we get to major grant planning and et cetera to show that sustainability through the board? So I think what this is asking is, how do we get the board involved if there's a barrier between direct communication with the board? I'm not sure how to overcome an internal problem quite like that, but I certainly can emphasize the importance of boards in this sustainability planning. There's been a number of occasions where I've been asked to come and speak to a board about getting them engaged in grant development, in particular helping them make connections to members of foundation boards or corporate alliances where they can then be the champion or the cheerleader for that organization and make that introduction to the executive director. So while there isn't an absolute answer to that question, it may be beneficial to have the board involved in some sort of retreat or training to better engage them to help the organization with funding, really because that's the only way you can show sustainability. And having the board actually give money and solicit gifts is also a really positive thing for sustainability. Another question that came through is that, let's see, it's actually a comment saying that partnerships can be a bit of a slippery slope as a sustainability factor because if partner B is supposed to provide a service or staff and loses their grant funding, then your model could fall apart. Well, that's true. If partner B is relying entirely on grant funding, it would put the program at risk. And that's really why we have to look at the four factors of where funding comes from. Just like you diversify, if you're into an investment, you diversify your own portfolio, you know that as a nonprofit, we have to rely on a number of different sources of revenue to be sustainable. So just having a grant really isn't a sustainable solution. So I would agree. That would really put a program in jeopardy. Danny, do you want to add to those questions at all? If not, I'll continue on. Let's look at some solutions for your next grant proposal. First of all, when do we start thinking about sustainability? Well, again, as early as possible. As Danny mentioned, if you're looking at getting partners or collaborations, it can take a long time. It can take even longer if you're looking at a major federal grant, even though sometimes we have 6 weeks to develop those. Developing those partnerships early on is definitely a strategic move. You might need a memorandum of understanding, letters of support, or any other written documents that ensure that partnership. You also want to start early on because you want to get your board involved, as we just discussed, get your leadership involved, and have real community buy-in. It may even involve some focus groups or community surveys to show that the project could be sustained throughout the long term. What kinds of things do you need to focus on? Well, to summarize, you need to make sure that your sustainability plan aligns with your mission and vision. It can't go off course from those. It needs to support specific action steps that lead to that mission and vision. And it can be a rather complex goal that requires things like partnerships and coalition building. But our bottom line is our goal is long-term change. It's long-term positive change and hence impact. So that's why sustaining outcomes becomes so important. And yes, funding is definitely part of those outcomes. In fact, if you look at those 12 sustainability factors, one of those is actually funding. But you notice it's not the only one. It's 1 out of 12. So just again to hammer that point that while you want to show your funding diversification, it isn't the only factor in sustainability. Number 4, who drives the sustainability efforts? Well, board and executive leadership in an organization are extremely important. You need them to get out in the community and to make sure that you have the resources you need and the community buy-in for that long-term change. Sustainability is based on, ultimately, that long-term change and collaboration, diversification of funding, sustaining outcomes, et cetera, all the things we have talked about. I'm going to let Danny chime in because I know that there's some additional things he may want to build on with this slide. And then we want to take some questions and have some dialogue about this very difficult topic. Sound good to you, Danny?
So you're throwing it back to me. Is that what you're saying?
You got it. What else do you want to add about this? What are some additional tips?
Well, I want folks to know that sustainability is not something that can be done in a vacuum, so that it is a deliberate process. It is something that you have to spend time on. And so you want to kind of focus and strengthen, and you want to have policies and procedures in place that actually allow for this too. I know that there are internal policies and procedures for approval of budget documents, so you have to start a year, 6 months in advance to be able to get your program through the budgeting process too. And so one of the questions is always, who actually is supposed to be driving sustainability efforts for my organization? And if you're not sure who that is, it might be you that could be the one that's supposed to be driving this. And so what is sustainability based on? I believe that it's based on collaboration. It's based on partnerships, but there was never a partnership that existed that both entities or multiple entities in the partnership didn't get something out of the partnership. So, for example, if you're in a partnership currently and you're not getting anything out of it for your organization or for your program, if it's a one-sided affair, so to speak, then it's not a partnership. It's something else, and it's not a positive thing. So, I guess overall, we've had a good time talking. We're running short on time, but we wanted to start answering your questions. And so I've seen a couple of things come up. Maybe, Margaret, are you ready?
Yeah, I'm going to read up another question that I just see in the chat box. And it says, in my higher education institution, we don't have the luxury of having close ties with the board for grant development. And that's pretty typical in higher education. I've seen that as well. The question continues. Also, many times we take on grant opportunities last minute with little time to develop partnerships and think about all of these things that we're mentioning here. So how can we approach the sustainability question if we don't have a lot of resources or partners, et cetera? And I'll add to et cetera, it's probably asking about time. And I think we all understand this challenge. This is a big one. A federal grant comes up, you have 6 weeks at the most to write it. Even if you're anticipating it's coming, you know that you're going to be trying to get people involved with you on this project team, and chances are in the last 2 weeks you're going to be struggling to put together this grant application. So, I hate to say it, but really trying to be proactive with your project is the only way to get through this. Sometimes I will work with organizations to develop strictly a project. We'll use a logic model, and we'll actually just map out a project, the outcomes, the evaluation procedures, all of the activities, all of the inputs, the project budget. And then we start customizing that to apply to various funders. It's the opposite of seeing the funding opportunity and reacting and quickly trying to put together a team and a proposal. So having said that, I know it's not always realistic because I know that sometimes a fantastic, unique federal grant or foundation grant opportunity comes up and you don't have the project developed yet. But it is something you want to do. It fits in with your mission, and somebody working with you or above you is saying, okay, go after that opportunity. So that becomes very tough. It's helpful if you have some partnerships already that maybe you worked with in the past. you may not get full board engagement. Your answer to the sustainability question might look more like this. It might say that you're in the process of developing an MOU with organization A, B, and C, or that you've had a strong working relationship with this organization in the past, and therefore you're in the process or anticipate their support for this particular program. So that's one of my answers to that question, and I appreciate it's a very difficult challenge. Danny, you've written a lot of federal and state grants for the organization. Do you have any advice for the person who's writing in from this higher education institution?
Well, I think, obviously there has to be the coordination of effort, and there are ways that you can address sustainability without actually having to go after additional grant sources. And so there are opportunities, I guess, that most people may not have thought of, like you could sell a product or service out of, from the proceeds or from the actual grant opportunity that created it. Like there's interesting ways that people get things funded. But when we write a grant, we come up with a sustainability plan. We try to do that in the beginning. And so we always look at these 4 different kinds of steps. And it does help us in winning the grant because we have a plan that we're going to implement. And so maybe they're not all successful. Maybe they're not necessarily how it gets done in the real world, but if there is a plan in place on paper that can be followed by the implementation team, I guess. I'm trying to be clear. Choose my words carefully.
There's another question coming up that asks, are we developing a sustainability plan just to win grants, or is that more an integral part of program planning and implementation regardless of sources of funding? At the beginning of the webinar, we really emphasized how important it is to have sustainability plans, not just to prove to your funders that we're going to spend your money well and that when it's gone, we're going to continue our impact. But the whole reason for the sustainability plan is really to make your organization effective and to have positive long-term change in the community. It's the reason why we're working 40-plus hours a week throughout the year is we want to make that difference. So I think you kind of answered your question, but definitely the sustainability plan is so important in throughout your program planning, not just to have a strong question to a funder. But because it is such a common question in grant applications and people struggle with it, we wanted to address it. Let's see, there's several other questions. Danny, is there one that's jumping out at you?
So there's a question here about what would be an example of how sustainability can be integrated early into my grant planning efforts. And so one of the things that we've done that in the past is we created a fundraising committee. We have them stood up and ready to go from before we actually submit the grant proposal. So they have already had an initial meeting. They have, before we even start writing. And so they have already considered a lot of the things that we need to have considered so that we can answer the question, yes. But then thinking long term, we're trying to integrate it into our budget. We're trying to integrate the project into the larger program for the folks that we're serving, because that pendulum swings, and once we start offering services, that becomes the new expectation. And so we don't want to pull those expectations down after we stand everything up and get those services rolling out for the beneficiaries. We want them to continue. And so we may not be able to continue at the same level. We may have to go after multiple different grants to make it happen, but we do want to come up with a plan. And so we would create maybe a calendar, and we would know when we were going to be seeking additional funding, putting things in the budget, when we would start charging for fees for services, when we would start doing our fundraising effort. We would start to make all those plans in writing. So I see another question is about I'm writing for a capital campaign, which is in its 5th year of 7. Are past funding successes a good indicator for new funders to show strong sustainability? Would growth of building use over the first 5 years be an indicator? And how the organization helps to grow? What else could be used? Yeah, this is this is a good question from Karen. She's trying to figure out how we're going to measure and evaluate sustainability, and honestly, that could be a whole different webinar, obviously. But and so you want to get away from tick marks on a whiteboard, number of people served, because it doesn't translate well when you're looking at the sustainability question and how you're going to continue the program afterwards, because the number of people served doesn't translate directly into the kinds of dollars that are on the ground that make the programs work. So looking for the impact that you make and how to measure those impacts. And so we always have to think about how we're changing behaviors. And of course, the most difficult things to measure and evaluate are feelings, thoughts, and attitudes. And so it does make it really difficult to do anything less than just a survey. But there's got to be other ways. Program evaluators can measure programs. They can measure the sustainable efforts. They can measure the impact, especially over a 5-year period. I believe that 5 years is certainly enough time to be able to evaluate the program and to come up with some measurable standards that can be used to talk about outcomes.
Okay, I'm going to read another question here. Actually, I just ran into a problem with the webinar. I'm having trouble actually seeing the slides. But I do remember there was one question that asked, how is a sustainability plan different from a strategic plan? Well, this is a good question. A strategic plan is really a much broader document. It's the plan that documents the organization's entire process, its strategy, its direction, how it makes decisions, how it serves the community. The sustainability plan is really a microcosm or a subset of that, because you may have a particular program or goal that you hope to sustain, and that's the focus of your sustainability plan. What I like about this question is that strategic planning is so important, and we know that grant applications often ask, how does this project fit into your strategic plan? So when you answer the sustainability question, I think it would be really effective to refer to your strategic plan, and that it's part of that planning process as well. But they are two very different things.
Good. Maybe you can answer this one for Valerie. It is a question, kind of a fundraising question. Maybe the grant-making experience background that you have can help. It's, how would you address the sustainability question on a grant application for capital funding, i.e. equipment, renovations, new building, et cetera?
Well, this one is one that I know, Danny, you covered a little bit in the last question about capital, but the nice thing about capital equipment is it has a life. And so maybe you're purchasing a pickup truck to serve a farm that is teaching veterans about agriculture and getting them back into the workforce. That's a piece of equipment that will have a long-term life, depending on how well you maintain it, but it's going to help serve the program for years. So in some ways, that one's actually easier than some of the other sustainability questions we have. I guess I would focus on what is the impact of that particular equipment and how many people will it serve over the long term.
Good. And then I've got one here. You answered the one about strategic plan versus sustainability plan. It looks like we've got another one here that says, can you guys recommend any other resources for building partnerships? Seems like everyone in Vicky's industry, which is homeless services, they have partnerships, and it's just to say that they have partnerships. Yeah, obviously this is something that you want to avoid. Go ahead.
No, I'm just laughing because I can relate to this. You know, I've seen several grant applications, and sometimes there's a long list of partnerships, and you wonder how many of those are real partnerships. One of the strategies that I've taken more recently, and that you may want to consider, is building partnerships not just with nonprofits or organizations that are in a similar sector as you, such as homelessness in this example, but with corporations that stand something to gain from your work. I know this may not be new to some listeners. They say, well, of course, we apply to corporate foundations all the time. But there might be some corporations out there or businesses that really benefit from what you're doing. And if you can make a case statement to them, a 1 or 2 page case statement, and get their attention, then they can now become a partner as well. And that would be different probably from some of the other partners they might be referring to. And of course, they could become a really good funder in the future. So definitely bringing them in. And we've done that in a number of different ways here.
And as far as resources go for partnerships, one of the techniques that we have used really well is that we start asking around in the community for who is the best partner. And we say when we're doing our discovery that we're trying to emulate them. And so what we're doing is we're identifying who would be the best person, group, organization to partner with. And then, of course, we look for ways that we can help them bring our resources, bring our talents and our volunteers to them so that we can kind of work together towards a common outcome. And so when we bring our partners, when we go to our partners, we're bringing them something with us, of something of value, whether it's our time, our political clout, or whatever it happens to be, because we always want there to be something that everybody gets in the partnership. All right, and I see we got one last one, which is how can there really only be 4 ways that nonprofits get money? And these are the 4 that we selected. It worked well with our presentation, and there are others. Obviously, you could probably think of some. You could probably throw them in the chat box. But there are some that come to mind. I get this question every once in a while, and so we've done a little bit of thinking about it. And so there are some shared services that may count as nonprofit resources, and so that would be sharing facilities with other organizations or partners. You could use your buying power. Say, for example, you have a large city, you have great buying power. You can use that group purchasing power to buy down goods and services that you share, that you use with other partners in your group. You can also offer accounting services at a reduced fee for smaller nonprofits in your area, if that's something that you're really good at. You can also do shared marketing services. This is something that, of course, the Grant Professionals Association does with the folks at the Grant Professional Certification Institute as well as the Grant Professionals Foundation, and that's a way of buying down and saving costs for everybody. It's not a way to get money per se, but it is a way to share resources. Of course, some organizations actually sub out their experts that they have on staff in a way to provide consulting services. I know that when I worked for the Regional Development Center, we served 8 counties in 26 cities, And so one of the things that I did as a grant professional in that arena is I wrote for member counties and cities grant applications, help them with fundraising plans, help them with planning documents in general, so that they could, compete on a larger scale with their peers. Also, human resource services could be pooled and shared as a way of cost savings. I don't know if, Margaret, you have any other ways that nonprofits get money?
I think those sound great. I think about crowdfunding, but crowdfunding has very limited applications, so it wouldn't be my top go-to at all.
Right,
it
that
has
one
worked for some arts and cultural organizations that I know of.
Totally. I was about to say the same thing. I think one of the interesting things about crowdsourcing is that it leads very quickly to donor fatigue. And so that's something that you want to avoid, as an organization for sure.
I would just like to kind of start to wrap up in terms of encouraging people to look at the document that is attached in the 12 sustainability factors, because there are several in there that might be really useful to you that we didn't cover on this webinar. As I look through this, it's things like government policies. I work with an organization that works on domestic violence issues, and only recently have physicians been required in the state to screen people for domestic violence as they come in for routine exams. So that is supporting the work of this particular nonprofit now, and it's a policy that over the long term will change how they work. So there may be a number of things happening in your community that are external factors that are really going to help support the cause and the reason you're doing the work you're doing. Make sure to put those into your sustainability answer and think about them in terms of the work you do, because again, as I mentioned at the beginning, this isn't just about answering a tough question for a funder, but we really wish you the best success with keeping your programs up in the long term and doing this great work.
And I too want to just say thanks to everybody for being on the call, for joining us for this discussion. And when you're approached out there in the world for a partnership opportunity, first and foremost, be a good partner. And I think that goes a long way in sustaining your organization and sustaining the good work that's going on in your community, is be a good partner.
Thank you both, Danny and Margit. Okay, so that concludes our webinar. Each of you should be seeing a short survey on your screen right now. So if you would be so kind to take a moment and evaluate the webinar, the presenters, and provide us with any future topics for our webinars. We're still compiling the schedule for the rest of the year and would love to know what you want to learn about. Margit and Danny, thank you so much for your time and expertise. Also, thanks to all of you who have attended. We're so glad that you can join us and hope that you found this session very helpful. Later today, you will receive the recorded version of this webinar, and please feel free to refer back to it at any time. Also, remember that this webinar qualifies for 1 credit towards the GPC CEUs. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we thank you again. Bye.